Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories. Please like and subscribe, and hit that notification icon so you never miss out. Now on with the stories.
I never thought I'd be caught up in such a ridiculous situation when I moved into this quiet little community. But here I am, smack in the middle of what I can only describe as the most absurd HOA drama I've ever witnessed. It all started when our former HOA board president, let's call him Bob, decided to turn the sidewalk in front of his house into some kind of tropical jungle. I'm not exaggerating. We're talking massive potted plants, the kind you'd expect to see in a botanical garden, not blocking a public walkway. At first, people just grumbled about it. You know how it is in these communities. Everyone's got an opinion, but nobody wants to be the one to start trouble. But as weeks went by, it became clear that Bob's green thumb was causing real problems. Kids on bikes had to swerve into the street to get around the leafy obstacle course. Elderly residents with walkers were forced to squeeze through narrow gaps between pots. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Finally, someone, not me, I swear, decided enough was enough and filed a formal complaint with the HOA. That's when things really went off the rails. The HOA board, minus Bob of course, had to address the issue. They sent him a polite letter asking him to move his plants off the sidewalk. Simple enough, right? Wrong. Bob went ballistic. He started ranting about his rights as a homeowner, his passion for horticulture, and how the community was trying to stifle his creativity. It was like watching a toddler throw a tantrum, except this toddler was a grown man with a mortgage and an inexplicable attachment to oversized ferns. Despite Bob's protests, the board stood firm. They gave him a deadline to move the plants or face fines. That's when Bob dropped the bombshell. He resigned from his position as board president in a huff. We all thought that would be the end of it. Bob would sulk for a while, move his plants, and life would go on. Oh, how naive we were. A few weeks later, whispers started circulating around the neighborhood. Bob was suing the HOA. At first, I thought it was a joke. I mean, who sues over some potted plants? But nope, it was real. And the reason? Brace yourself for this one. Bob claimed that the stress of being told to move his plants had caused such emotional distress that it had affected his sex life. Yes, you read that right. According to Bob, he and his wife could not knock boots anymore because of the plant drama. Now, I'm no prude, but I really didn't need to know about Bob's bedroom problems. And I certainly didn't want to be involved in paying for them. Because that's what Bob was asking for, minus $100,000 from the HOA to compensate for his lost sexy time. When the news broke, the community went into an uproar. People were furious. How dare Bob try to make us pay for his performance issues? And who the hell values their sex life at $100,000? I mean, I enjoy a good roll in the hay as much as the next person, but putting a six-figure price tag on it seemed a bit excessive. The whole situation quickly devolved into a circus. Neighbors were taking sides, arguing at community meetings, and gossiping over their fences. I overheard one elderly lady say, "If those plants make him that excited, maybe he should keep them in the bedroom." I nearly choked on my coffee. The HOA board was in a panic. They hadn't budgeted for sex lawsuit in their annual financial plan. Shocking. I know. They called an emergency meeting to discuss our options. I decided to attend, partly out of curiosity and partly because I was worried about how this might affect our HOA fees. The meeting was a disaster. Half the residents were yelling about how we shouldn't give in to Bob's ridiculous demands. The other half were worried about the potential legal costs if we fought the lawsuit. And then there was Bob, sitting in the back with a smug look on his face, probably fantasizing about all the new plants he could buy with $100,000. Our new HOA president, a nervous-looking man named Dave, tried to maintain order. "Please, everyone, let's discuss this calmly," he pleaded. Fat chance of that happening. One resident stood up and shouted, "Why don't we just buy Bob some Viagra and call it a day?" The room erupted in laughter, but Bob didn't find it funny. He stormed out, muttering something about uncultured Philistines who don't appreciate fine horticulture. As the meeting dragged on, it became clear that we were in a lose-lose situation. If we fought the lawsuit, we'd rack up massive legal fees. If we settled, we'd be setting a dangerous precedent. What's next? Someone suing because the color of their neighbor's house killed their libido? In the end, the board decided to consult with a lawyer before making any decisions. We all left the meeting feeling frustrated and a little dirty, like we just watched a really bad soap opera. Over the next few weeks, the lawsuit was all anyone could talk about. People started making jokes about Bob's magic plants and the $100,000 bedroom. Some neighbors even put up signs in their yards saying, "My plants don't affect my sex life." It was childish, sure, but can you blame them? Meanwhile, Bob seemed to be reveling in all the attention. He gave an interview to the local paper, waxing poetic about his deep connection to nature and how the HOA's tyrannical rule had wilted his passion flower. I'm not making this up. Those were his exact words. I had to read the article twice to make sure it wasn't satire. As if things weren't ridiculous enough, a local gardening supply store got wind of the story and decided to capitalize on it. They started running ads featuring a winking cartoon plant with the slogan, "Our plants are guaranteed to spice up your love life or your money back." I couldn't look at a ficus the same way after that. The whole situation was taking a toll on our community. People were stressed, angry, and embarrassed. Our once peaceful neighborhood had turned into a laughingstock. I couldn't go to the grocery store without someone making a plant-related innuendo. It was exhausting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was actually about 2 months, our lawyer came back with his recommendation. His advice? Settle the case. I was shocked. How could we possibly give in to Bob's insane demands? But as the lawyer explained, fighting the case could end up costing us more in the long run. Plus, there was always the risk that some oddball jury might actually side with Bob. The board called another meeting to vote on the settlement. The atmosphere was tense. Nobody wanted to give Bob a cent, but we also didn't want this circus to continue. Dave, our poor, beleaguered HOA president, looked like he had aged 10 years in 2 months. He stood up and addressed the room. "I know this isn't what any of us want, but our lawyer thinks it's the best course of action. We're proposing to settle for $50,000. The room exploded. People were yelling, crying, and I'm pretty sure I saw someone throw a shoe. It took almost an hour for things to calm down enough for us to actually vote. In the end, the settlement passed by a narrow margin. We were going to pay Bob $50,000 to drop the lawsuit and never speak of this again. It felt like admitting defeat, like we were rewarding his ridiculous behavior. But what choice did we have? The money would come from our reserve fund, which meant our dues would have to go up to replenish it. So not only were we paying for Bob's imaginary sex problems, but we'd be paying for years to come. Talk about adding insult to injury. When Bob heard about the settlement, he had the audacity to act magnanimous. He issued a statement saying he was pleased that the HOA had seen reason, and that he looked forward to cultivating a more harmonious relationship with the community. I had to resist the urge to go plant something unpleasant in his yard. The day Bob came to collect his check was surreal. He showed up at Dave's house with a shit-eating grin and a potted peace lily as a gesture of goodwill. Dave looked like he wanted to shove that peace lily somewhere very unpeaceful. As news of the settlement spread, our community became a cautionary tale for HOAs everywhere. I heard from a friend in another state that their association had used our story as an example of why clear rules about sidewalk obstructions were necessary. Great, we were famous for all the wrong reasons. In the aftermath, our HOA board instituted a bunch of new rules. No plants on sidewalks, no lawsuits without mediation first, and definitely no claims about gardening-related sexual dysfunction. It all seemed so ridiculous, but then again, so was this entire ordeal. Bob, flush with his settlement money, moved out of the neighborhood a few months later. Rumor has it he bought a big property in the country where he could indulge his plant obsession without bothering anyone. Good riddance, I say. As for the rest of us, we were left to pick up the pieces. Our HOA fees went up, our property values took a hit. Turns out, home of the $50,000 plant sex lawsuit isn't a great selling point, and we all had to live with the embarrassment of what had happened. It's been a year since the whole fiasco, and things are finally starting to get back to normal. The sidewalks are clear, our bank account is slowly recovering, and people have mostly stopped making plant puns. But every now and then, when I'm out for a walk and I see a particularly large potted plant, I can't help but shudder. Who knew that a few oversized ferns could cause so much trouble? I certainly didn't when I moved here. If I had, I might have chosen a nice plant-free apartment instead. So if you're thinking of moving into an HOA community, let my story be a warning to you. Read the bylaws carefully, attend the meetings, and for the love of all that's holy, keep your plants off the sidewalk. your sex life, and your wallet. Well, thank you. Bob's tantrum over his precious potted plants is a classic case of a man who thinks his horticultural hobbies are more important than the safety and well-being of his neighbors. It's astonishing that someone so self-absorbed could ever be trusted to lead a community. If he spent half as much time caring for his neighbors as he does for his oversized ferns, we wouldn't be in this ridiculous mess. Honestly, Bob's lawsuit is the perfect example of how entitlement can warp a person's sense of reality. To think that blocking sidewalks with his gaudy plants somehow enhances his sex life is laughable. Maybe if he focused less on his garden and more on being a decent neighbor, he wouldn't be facing such public ridicule. Good riddance. Bob's decision to sue the HOA over his emotional distress is nothing short of pathetic. It's hard to believe that someone who claims to be a creative gardener could be so creatively delusional. His inflated ego and desperate need for attention have turned our once peaceful community into a laughingstock. If he thinks $100,000 will fix his problems, he's more out of touch than I ever imagined. Be me, a lowly middle-class individual in a very high cost of living location. I spent years saving up for a single-family home to move in and start a family. The journey was grueling. I fought my way through 25 other offers and ended up paying 15% over the asking price. But finally, I moved into my new home and met my elderly neighbor. She seemed completely normal at first. A few weeks later, I pulled my boat out of storage. It's a 30-year-old wakeboard boat, around 21 feet long. I was extremely excited that I had finally managed to snag a place where I could store it. I put it in the space to the right of my driveway, feeling a sense of accomplishment. A few hours later, my elderly neighbor backed out of her driveway and saw the boat. "Is that going to be a permanent fixture?" she asked. "Probably," I replied. "I can't see the road when I back out," she complained. "There's not much I can do about that," I said, trying to keep things civil. From that moment on, she scowled at me every time she saw me. I tried to ignore it, thinking it would blow over. But imagine my shock when another neighbor knocked on my door a few days later. He had received a letter in the mail stating that a neighborhood coalition was being formed to sue me for parking my boat in my driveway. They referenced covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, that I wasn't even aware of. I dug through my title paperwork and found the CC&Rs buried deep within. It wasn't an HOA, but a 50-year-old document that technically allowed them to sue me over this. I was flabbergasted. There were boats and RVs all over the neighborhood. It seemed like I just had the misfortune of having a particularly bad neighbor. Determined not to be bullied, I decided to call a property attorney. I also made a mental note to avoid HOAs and CC&R neighborhoods in the future. My next step was to go around the neighborhood and take photos of all the boats and RVs parked in driveways. I emailed them to myself for documentation. If they decided to sue me, I would have evidence to show that I was being unfairly targeted. I also started to wonder if any of the people who were part of this coalition owned boats or RVs themselves. A polite mention that I would countersue if they continued might be in order if that was the case. It didn't seem like a case of selective enforcement since there was no HOA, but rather a covenant. The only way to enforce it was through a suit for an injunction. Since there was no governing body, an individual had to file the suit. I researched more about these covenants. Failure to enforce them sets a precedent, and the local government might consider them unenforceable. This had happened in an old neighborhood of mine. I documented all the current violations I could see. My favorite covenant was the requirement for every home to have a trash compactor in the kitchen. It was the first thing we ripped out when we moved in. I also checked my state laws to see if the CC&Rs had a default expiration date. When I bought my house, I had an elderly neighbor tell me all about the rules and what we could or couldn't do. I soon found out that in my state, the covenants automatically expired after 30 years. And wouldn't you know it, the development was over 30 years old. It was worth looking into to be sure. I also needed to determine if I was required to be notified about these covenants at the time I purchased the house. Failure to notify could nullify them. A restrictive covenant banning parking a boat, running a business, or raising livestock is common in suburban areas. Many cities have similar restrictions. Definitely something to look out for. In my state, CO, we have laws that dictate what HOAs are allowed to control. In this scenario, the HOA could, and likely would, cause an absolute fuss over what is parked in the driveway. However, Where it backfires on them is that HOAs have no jurisdiction over public roadways. Most neighborhoods here have streets considered public. So, to really stick it to them, you just move whatever they have an issue with from your driveway to the street. It's a loophole that drives them crazy because they can no longer control it. Often, an RV, trailer, or boat on the road is more of an annoyance than in someone's driveway. But I had to be careful because many cities have ordinances over having trailers parked on the street longer than a certain number of days. I didn't want to trade one problem for another. I also considered the possibility of storing the boat in a garage or carport, but that would defeat the purpose of having bought a home with a driveway big enough for it. As the days went by, I noticed the elderly neighbor watching me more intently. Every time I stepped out of the house, her eyes followed me. It was unsettling, but I tried to brush it off. I had more important things to worry about, like the potential lawsuit hanging over my head. I decided to talk to some of the other neighbors to gauge their opinions. Maybe they didn't even know about the coalition forming against me. I knocked on a few doors and explained my situation. Most of them were sympathetic and had no issue with my boat. Some even shared their own horror stories about dealing with the elderly neighbor. One neighbor told me about how she had tried to get them to cut down a tree in their yard, citing some old covenants. They had expired years ago, but she still tried to enforce them. It seemed like I wasn't the first person she had targeted. Armed with this new information, I felt a bit more confident. I wasn't alone in this fight. I continued documenting everything and kept my attorney updated. I also started looking into the possibility of getting the covenants nullified. If they were over 50 years old, there was a good chance they were no longer enforceable. Days turned into weeks, and I still hadn't heard anything more about the lawsuit. Maybe the coalition had realized they didn't have a leg to stand on. Or maybe they were just biding their time. Either way, I wasn't going to let them bully me into submission. I kept my boat right where it was, a symbol of my hard-earned success and determination. Every time I looked at it, I felt a sense of pride. I had worked too hard to let a few disgruntled neighbors push me around. The elderly neighbor continued to scowl at me, but I didn't let it bother me. I knew I was in the right, and I had the support of most of my neighbors. I also knew that if push came to shove, I had the evidence and legal backing to fight back. In the end, it was a matter of principle. I wasn't just fighting for my right to park my boat in my driveway. I was fighting for my right to enjoy my property without unnecessary interference. And that was a fight I wasn't willing to lose. Will they, though? Boats and RVs all over doesn't mean everyone has one. I would say a neighborhood where 1 in 10 houses have one could be described that way. So will the neighbor care that a couple of people around her are upset? The same people she probably really thought had trashy yards and just wasn't motivated to do anything about? And will all or even most of the people actually put the blame on this woman, or will they put the blame on the guy who dragged them into this shit? I think it would be a lot more effective to make nice with the rest of the neighborhood and figure out how and if it's possible to change the rules while also targeting the people who brought the suit with every possible violation they might have. Failure to enforce covenants can create a precedent that leads local authorities to view them as unenforceable. This occurred in a charming neighborhood where a set of covenants aimed to preserve its character, including a quirky requirement for every home to have a visible sundial. As new residents moved in and the homeowners association became inactive, many began ignoring these rules. Bright paint colors replaced approved shades, and sundials were often removed. Concerned longtime residents started documenting these violations, discovering that nearly 60% of homes were non-compliant. When they approached local officials for enforcement, they were met with resistance, as the lack of enforcement had effectively nullified the covenants. This situation highlights the importance of consistent enforcement and regular reviews of community standards to maintain the neighborhood's unique charm. While some welcomed the changes, others mourned the loss of their community's character, emphasizing the need for balance between tradition and modernity. My wife found an old covenant while working in a surveying office in North Carolina. It forbade selling property to people of the Negro, Spanish, and Jewish races. A coworker in Tennessee was threatened with a suit for a new shed by a neighbor. Slave quarters was the only additional structures permitted on the property per the covenant. It's hard to take covenants all that seriously.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.